Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, the only place where bedtime stories involve ink-stained fingers, heated religious censorship, and the sweet scent of boiled glue in the morning. Tonight, we're not whispering lullabies. We're stepping into the smoky alleys of 16th century Venice, the start-up capital of the printed word. Before Silicon Valley had its servers, Venice had its presses. And instead of coffee-fueled coders, there were sweaty apprentices resetting movable type by candlelight. One sneeze, and the whole page was ruined. So, if you've ever cursed your printer for jamming one page before a deadline, imagine binding 400 pages by hand while avoiding the Inquisition. Pull your blanket tight and tuck your fingers away from sharp paper edges. Because this is what it was really like to be a Renaissance printer in Venice. Chapter 1, Venice, the world's printing capital. You could smell Venice long before you saw it. Not because of rot. Though, let's be honest, the canals had their moments. But because of salt. Salt in the air, salt in the fish, salt in the pages of books that had travelled across continents. By the early 1500s, Venice wasn't just a port. It was an empire disguised as a city, floating on trade routes, political manoeuvring, and a delicate cocktail of economic ego and cultural ambition. And nestled within this floating kingdom was a trade that would outlive the doges and redefine civilization: printing. At first glance, the Venetian print shop didn't look like the cradle of the modern world. It looked like a warehouse that had lost a fight with a coal cart. Wooden beams blackened with soot, paper hanging like cured meats from the ceiling, and a smell. Oh God, the smell. Of hot oil, damp wood, ink made from soot and vinegar, and sometimes, when the wind shifted, dead fish from the nearby market. But step inside and you'd hear it. The rhythm of the Renaissance. The heavy wooden press creaking. The thud of ink balls against type. The scrape of metal as letters were lined up, one, by apprentices who were usually 12, half-blind, and one bad day away from screaming into the Adriatic. One of them, let's say, was Luca. Thin, underfed, with blackened fingers and a cynical smirk that made him look older than his 15 years. Luca didn't read the books he helped print. He couldn't. Literacy wasn't required for aligning the word Cicero. All he needed was precision, patience, and fingers fast enough to dodge the master's slap. Venice had over 200 print shops at its peak, more than any city in Europe. Why? Because it had the perfect storm. Paper imported from nearby mills, Greek and Latin scholars flooding the universities, an open market for books thanks to merchants and theologians, and, critically, a government just corrupt enough to let you publish things slightly illegal as long as you paid in ducats. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Yes, Venice gave us Aldus Manutius, the man who invented italic type and the portable pocketbook. But it also gave us book piracy, mass layoffs, and the Renaissance version of IP theft. Entire editions were stolen, typesets copied, and new. Translations printed faster than a bar gossip could turn into a lawsuit. The truth? Most printers didn't live like scholarly heroes. They lived like factory workers. They inhaled mercury from gold leaf preparation. Their hands were calloused, burned, and ink-stained beyond repair. The average Venetian printer's lifespan hovered just below the city's average, dragged down by lead poisoning, overwork, and the occasional paper cut that turned gangrenous because antibiotics weren't a thing yet. And yet, despite this daily grind, Venice's print shops were the internet cafes of their time. A printer might be working on a Greek philosophy manuscript in the morning, a pornographic satire by lunch, and a government edict banning blasphemy by sunset. Printed, of course, on the very same press. That's what you call Renaissance multitasking. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Venice wasn't just printing for Venetians. Books printed here were smuggled into France, read in Polish courts, debated in German universities. The reach of Venice's presses extended farther than its navy, and that scared a lot of people. especially the church. But we'll get to that in another chapter. For now, picture young Luca wiping sweat from his brow, squinting at a backward line of type, and realizing, maybe, that the book he's helping create might one day sit in the hands of a pope or be burned by him, all in a day's work. Let's step back into the shop. It's nearly midnight and the press is still going. The air is thick, not just with heat, but with something that clings to the lungs, a mix of vaporized linseed oil, soot from candles, and the damp rot of too many bodies in too little space. You'd think printing books was a quiet, intellectual affair. It wasn't. It was noisy, filthy, and more industrial than inspirational. The press itself, a hulking wooden structure modelled after a wine press, took 2 men to operate, one to ink the type, another to crank the screw that pushed paper onto the letters with enough force to leave a mark, but not enough to split the paper. If you got the pressure wrong, you wasted a page. Do it too often, and you wasted your job. Luca, our unfortunate apprentice, had learned this the hard way. His left hand bore a scar from where the platane, the top part of the press, had caught his fingers during a rush order for a papal decree. That decree, ironically, banned printers from working on Sundays. Nobody listened. Venetian printers lived under impossible deadlines. Books were money, and delays meant disaster. When Aldus Manutius first printed his famed octavo editions, small, portable books, his competitors stole his typeface within weeks. Entire counterfeit editions flooded the market, often riddled with errors. One infamous pirate version of Aristotle's Ethics omitted entire chapters and included a dirty joke about monks in the margin, possibly inserted as a prank or a protest. No one's sure. That's the Renaissance for you. Noble ideals printed with stolen fonts by underpaid labourers working 16-hour shifts. And then came the censors. You see, Venice prided itself on freedom, as long as that freedom didn't offend anyone powerful. Printers were required to submit works to the Council of Ten, a shadowy governing body that reviewed material for heresy, sedition, or moral contamination. But the rules were vague, enforcement was inconsistent, and bribery was, well, let's just say the ink wasn't the only thing that changed hands. Some printers made entire side incomes printing banned books on the sly, stashing them beneath legitimate works and smuggling them out of the city in crates marked fish sauce or candles. If caught, the penalties ranged from fines to having your press publicly dismantled, your hands broken, or, in particularly dramatic cases, being exiled. Luca once watched a rival shop across the canal get shut down after printing a Greek translation of a book the church hadn't even read yet. They just didn't like the title. But danger didn't end with censorship. Fire, that old enemy of civilization, haunted every print shop. The ink was flammable. The paper dried on racks above open flame, and shops were often located in overcrowded wooden buildings. A single overturned oil lamp could erase months of work. One major fire in 1534 destroyed 3 shops, killed 6 workers, and caused a shortage of Latin grammars that lasted nearly a year. And the only reason the blaze didn't spread farther? It started raining. Let's take a moment to appreciate that the future of human knowledge was saved by bad weather. And yet, amid all this chaos, Venetian printers were proud, not of the money, though some did get rich, but of their role in history. They saw themselves not just as craftsmen, but as midwives of knowledge, delivering ideas into the world one sheet at a time. Take Matteo, one of the older typesetters in Luca's shop. He'd once worked for Aldus himself and had a crooked back from decades spent hunched over cases of lead type. Matteo could compose in 3 languages: backward, upside down, and under pressure. He told stories of the early days when they printed Erasmus's works under threat of papal interdiction, when each letter set was an act of rebellion and every page a potential miracle. "You want to know power?" Matteo once whispered to Luca, gesturing at the press. "It's not gold, not swords. It's this. You want to shake the world? printer heresy in Latin. The irony wasn't lost on Luca that Matteo's current assignment was reprinting a cookbook for a noble family that demanded gold-embossed initials and a custom woodcut of their dog-eating stew. But that was the life. One day, revolution, the next day, dog stew. Still, the printers believed in something bigger. They had to. Why else endure the burns, the blisters, the blackened lungs, and the constant threat of jail for putting the wrong semicolon in a Bible? Because in those days, a single misprint could spark a war. Seriously. In 1521, a printer in Florence accidentally swapped 2 lines in a treatise on marriage. The resulting passage implied that the Pope had fathered 6 illegitimate children, which led to riots, arrests, and the printer being thrown into the Arno River wearing nothing but his apron. Accuracy mattered. So did loyalty, and knowing when to look the other way. Printers walked a tightrope between patronage and principle. They printed whatever the market demanded. Greek philosophy, church edicts, scandalous poetry, astrological charts, even manuals on how to seduce noblewomen using perfume and flattery. A Renaissance bestseller, if you can believe it. But they also risked everything to print books no one else dared touch. And Venice made it all possible. Its wealth, its corruption, its networks, all helped spread ideas like wildfire, even if the matches were lit in darkness. So next time you flip through a book or curse your slow-loading PDF, spare a thought for Luca and Matteo. For the cracked skin, the smoke-filled lungs, the stolen fonts, and the heresies pressed into paper. Because without them, we wouldn't be reading at all. Chapter 2. Inside the print shop. You could tell the time in a Venetian print shop by the colour of the ink under your fingernails. At dawn, it was sticky and fresh. By noon, it was already caked into your cuticles, seeping into calluses you forgot you had. By midnight, it had become part of you, like blood, but darker, and harder to wash off. The romantic image we've built of Renaissance printing usually skips over the part where ink was made from soot, oil, and boiled animal glue. That's right, boiled bones. Horses mostly. Sometimes cattle. You didn't just smell like a printer, you smelled like a medieval butcher shop that accidentally learned Latin. The workspace itself was cramped, hot, and aggressively unergonomic. The floor was always wet, either from spilled water used to dampen paper, or from someone vomiting after inhaling lead dust. The ceiling hung low with sheets of drying paper, giving the entire room the feeling of a claustrophobic forest made of fragile ghosts. If a fire broke out, and they often did, you had roughly 6 seconds to decide whether to save the manuscript, your co-worker, or your own skin. Most chose the manuscript. There was no such thing as personal space. Apprentices like Luca were wedged between tight cases and the press itself, elbow to elbow with grown men who smoked, coughed, and cursed in 5 dialects. If you were lucky, your master was only a perfectionist. If you were unlucky, he was also a drunk, a gambler, and a fan of throwing galley trays when displeased. And displeased they often were. One misplaced letter, and you could ruin an entire folio. Imagine lining up over 2,500 tiny metal letters by hand for a single printed sheet. Then imagine doing that without making a single error. Now at a deadline. A candle that keeps going out. A press that creaks like it's possessed. And a rat chewing on your lunch. That was Tuesday. The type itself was cast from molten lead, tin, and antimony. Casting type meant pouring liquid metal into a mould the size of a child's finger, then filing the edge until it was just sharp enough to nick you if your attention slipped. Which it always did. Because the shop was loud, full of distractions, and oh yes, filled with people slowly being poisoned by the very tools of their trade. Lead poisoning wasn't theoretical, it was real. Typesetters often developed trembling hands, clouded vision, and what later generations would call printer's palsy. It gave them away in the street, the slow limp, the twitching eyelid, the perpetual cough that rattled like parchment in a breeze. No one talked about it. What else were you going to do? Go back to fishing? Work in the arsenals? At least printing killed you with a little dignity. And yet, somehow, the rhythm of the shop continued. The pressmen, those poor souls who operated the actual printing machine, were among the strongest men in the building. Not strong like a soldier, but strong like a man who's lifted the same heavy object 10,000 times and grown a new layer of muscle just for that task. Their arms were slabs, their shirts soaked with sweat, their shoulders hunched permanently like question marks carved into human flesh. They worked in teams of two, one to ink the form, another to operate the press. Inking involved pounding a ball of dog skin. Yes, literal dog skin soaked in ink against the metal letters until the coverage was just right. Then came the paper, carefully dampened and trimmed. Then the screeching wheel, the crushing force, the hiss of press-meeting platen. Each sheet had to dry for days, sometimes weeks, depending on humidity and whether the paper had been improperly sized. If it hadn't been treated with the right mixture of animal gelatin, the ink would bleed, the page would warp, and the buyer, usually a noble or scholar, would demand a refund, a reprint, or your head on a spike. There were no customer service departments in Renaissance Venice, just angry men with swords and reputations. Then came binding, or, as it was known in the shop, the part where you bleed. Paper cuts were the least of your worries. Binding required knives, needles, glue, and strips of leather soaked in brine and scraped until they resembled ribbon. Most binding rooms smelled like vinegar and despair. The glue, often made from fish bones and animal cartilage, had to be heated daily and stirred constantly, or it would harden into something indistinguishable from fossilized vomit. One slip, and you glued your fingers together. 2 slips, and you glued your fingers to the book. After that, you got a nickname, usually involving profanity, and someone else had to finish your shift while you soaked your hand in wine to dissolve the mess. Books weren't just printed. They were assembled, like corpses in a mad scientist's lab. Pages were stitched in gatherings, pressed under weights, trimmed by hand, covered in wooden boards wrapped in leather and sometimes chained. Literally chained. Many books were so valuable they were physically locked to tables in libraries to prevent theft. You didn't borrow a book in Venice. You visited it, like a prisoner visits their lawyer. But here's the twist. Despite all this, despite the poison, the injuries, the exhaustion, printers took pride in their work. Not because it was lucrative. It rarely was. Most shops ran on credit and hope. But because they were gatekeepers of something sacred. Knowledge. Truth. Sometimes lies, yes, but beautiful lies in beautiful fonts. Even the apprentices knew it. Luca, with his split knuckles and ink-black nails, once held a freshly printed page of Aristotle and stared at it like it was gold. He couldn't read a word, but he understood it mattered, that it had weight, that someone would open that book and learn something or argue with it or start a revolution because of it. The irony is that Renaissance printing was as much about control as it was about freedom. You were free to print until someone powerful didn't like what you printed. Then you were free to be fined, flogged, or forgotten. And yet, every day, the presses rolled on. Type was set, paper trimmed, bindings stitched, and books sent out into the world like ships without sails. Some would be read, others burned. A few would vanish for centuries, only to resurface in dusty archives and become the subject of overpriced museum exhibits. But all of them passed through hands like Luca's. Hands blistered, cracked, ink-stained, and quietly, defiantly human. A Venetian printing shop didn't just run on ink and sweat. It ran on obsession. Obsession with alignment, with symmetry, with the excruciating dream of creating a perfect page in a world where nothing else was perfect. Not the wages, not the air, not even the paper. But a page could be immortal. Let's not pretend printers were humble servants of knowledge. Many were egotists with ink-stained robes and god complexes. They weren't just setting type, They were rebuilding civilization, one letter at a time. Or so they told themselves. Loudly, repeatedly, especially at book fairs. In truth, most printers were trapped in a psychological feedback loop of anxiety and ambition. They worked 14-hour days, crammed into wooden rooms that smelled like a mix of burning oil, musty paper, and whatever rodents hadn't yet been driven out. They suffered frequent migraines from squinting at reversed metal characters under candlelight, all while listening to the pressmen argue about the cost of beef fat and whether or not Luther was a heretic or just misunderstood. One letter out of place, just one, and it could doom an entire edition. Imagine typesetting a Latin Bible only to accidentally turn Deus God into Deus, a minor deity, or worse, Deus into Deus Ex, with no machina in sight. Congratulations, you've just invented theology no one asked for. Now the church wants a word. Inquisition optional, but always implied. And don't think editors existed as they do today. Editors back then were more like unpaid freelancers who would visit the shop once a week, scribble a few corrections in the margins, and then vanish to the tavern until payday. The burden of accuracy fell squarely on the shoulders of the compositor, often a teenager like Luca, who, again, couldn't actually read Latin. That never stopped anyone, of course. Literacy was a privilege. Printing was a gamble. Even the design of letters was a battlefield. Typefaces were serious business. The right font could make your book the talk of Florence. The wrong one could make it a laughingstock. Printers often customized their own letters, jealously guarding typefaces, like medieval blacksmiths guarding sword molds. Aldus Manutius, that legendary Venetian printer with a soft spot for Greek classics and unrelenting deadlines, practically invented the idea of branding with his signature dolphin and anchor logo and slanted italic script. His competitors? They didn't even wait for him to finish his editions before they started counterfeiting them. In fact, Venice was the global capital of early intellectual property theft. Books were pirated faster than they could be printed. Unsold sheets were scavenged by rival shops and rebranded. Even mistakes were copied, so identical that scholars centuries later mistook bootlegs for originals. The modern tech world didn't invent cloning. Venice just did it with more style and less electricity. Now, you'd think the government might have stepped in to regulate things. Technically, yes. The Venetian Senate issued printing privileges known as privilegia, limited monopolies that protected certain titles or authors. But enforcement was, theoretical at best. If your cousin sat on the local council, or your brother knew a doge's mistress, your illegal print run was suddenly authorized. A wink, a nod, a few coins slipped under the table. And that Aristotle commentary was as legitimate as the Bible, or at least as legitimate as it needed to be to make a profit. And then there was the correctio, that dreaded page inserted at the end of a book, listing all known printing errors in the edition, the Renaissance version of, "We messed up, but please don't sue us." If you printed 100 copies and found an error in line 72 of page 145, you'd just slap a note in the back, "Oops. Purgatory should read parchment. Our bad." If the error was big enough, say, accidentally referring to the Pope as a prostitute, yes, that happened. You either reprinted the page or burned the edition and tried to forget about it. Of course, errors were inevitable. Type wore down, paper warped. Apprentices fell asleep mid-assembly. There's a record of one shop that accidentally printed an entire folio upside down. Instead of fixing it, they sold it as a unique mirrored edition. Marketing spin is not a modern invention, it turns out, but not every error was laughable. In 1551, a printer was arrested for including an unauthorized woodcut of the Virgin Mary with exposed ankles. An act deemed so obscene the entire print run was confiscated, and the poor illustrator was whipped in the plaza for moral perversion. If that sounds harsh, remember, this was the same city that sold censored erotica with hand-painted fig leaves added afterward to meet church guidelines. Hypocrisy, like printing ink, was always in ready supply. Meanwhile, the division of labour inside the shop was clear. The master handled clients, accounts, and bribery. The journeyman set the type and barked at the apprentices. The apprentices did everything else: fetched paper, mixed ink, filed broken letters, and occasionally swept the floor when someone important walked in. Everyone had to know their place, even if that place was halfway under a drying rack with a stack of paper crushing your spine. You didn't complain. Complaining got you replaced. And you didn't want to go back to hauling sewage or scrubbing decks on merchant galleys. At least here, in the print shop, you were contributing to something, maybe even history. Although, if we're being honest, a lot of what was printed wasn't exactly Socratic dialogue or divine revelation. You had cheap almanacs filled with astrological nonsense, bizarre pseudo-scientific treatises about curing gout with goat urine, pamphlets accusing rival families of consorting with demons. One best-selling book claimed that cheese had a soul and could be taught philosophy if aged properly, and people bought it, in droves. Because the printing press didn't just democratize knowledge, it democratized nonsense. And that, perhaps, was its most Renaissance feature of all. Still, the machinery rolled on. The press groaned, the ink spread, the words were captured, not in stone, but in smeared black lines on aging paper. If the library was the memory of a civilization, then the print shop was its mouth. Speaking, shouting, whispering, and sometimes lying all at once. And inside it, men like Luca. Boys becoming men too fast. Men becoming machines too slowly. Fingers sore, eyes red, backs bent, yet still proud. Still in awe that their work would travel farther than they ever could. That their fingerprints, in a sense, would outlive them. That was the print shop. Crude, cramped, unforgiving, but also, in its own twisted way, glorious. Chapter 3. The Artisans Behind the Pages. If you ever walked into a Renaissance print shop and assumed the most important man was the one standing by the press shouting orders, you'd be wrong. Loud, yes. Important, debatable. The real power. The unsung force that shaped everything from sacred scripture to scandalous satire was in the hands of the artisans who rarely spoke, rarely slept, and rarely received credit. This chapter belongs to them, because, while the merchant printers haggled over prices and the apprentices got their ears boxed for dropping type trays, the artisans carved civilization into paper, one painstaking movement at a time. Let's start with the punch cutter. Romantic name, right? Sounds like a swashbuckling assassin. But in reality, a punch cutter was a man who carved the alphabet itself. Each letter was first shaped, backwards of course, into a tiny piece of hardened steel, using files so small they looked like dental tools stolen from a sadist. You needed nerves of iron, eyesight sharper than a hawk, and the patience of a monk who'd taken a vow to never blink. A single serif 1 curve of a lowercase r could take hours. One slip of the hand, and your E looked like an O with an attitude problem. Get it wrong, and 1,000 copies would carry that mistake across Europe. No pressure. Punch cutters were secretive and solitary. They hoarded techniques like alchemists guarding the philosopher's stone. Some refused apprentices. Others worked by candlelight in locked basements, afraid their rivals would steal their methods, or worse, their typeface. It wasn't paranoia. It was business. And yes, typefaces were guarded like state secrets. The spacing, the weight, the flourishes. These weren't just aesthetics. They were identity. Aldus Manutius made italic type famous, but dozens of forgotten craftsmen made it beautiful. Do you think Aldus carved the letters himself? Please. That would be like assuming Steve Jobs soldered iPhones in his garage. Next came the matrix maker, a man with an even duller title and an even harder job. After the punch cutter finished his steel letter, the matrix maker would hammer it into a softer copper blank to create a mould. That mould would then be used to cast hundreds, sometimes thousands of identical letters in molten lead. And if the mould was even slightly warped, every letter would wobble on the page like a drunken monk trying to copy scripture. Now imagine doing that for 26 lowercase letters, 26 uppercase, all the ligatures, numbers, punctuation, and specialized diacritics for Latin, Greek, and sometimes Hebrew or Arabic. And you had to do this not just once, but for every font size your client wanted. The Renaissance may have been a rebirth of knowledge, but it came with a severe case of carpal tunnel. Then there was the woodcut artist, whose job was to turn empty margins into divine visions or nightmares, depending on the commission. Woodcuts were the visual grammar of the Renaissance. Maps, diagrams, saints, monsters, anatomical drawings, erotic scenes. If you could imagine it, a Venetian woodcutter could carve it. With knives. Not the fancy fine-tipped engraving tools of later centuries. No, these artisans used blades closer to kitchen knives and chisels that hadn't seen sharpening stones in months. They worked on pierwood or boxwood blocks, both hard enough to split fingernails and dense enough to hold an image through multiple pressings. They carved in reverse, often drunk, often squinting, and sometimes by memory. Why memory? Because many couldn't read the texts they were illustrating. They were told, "This is a lion devouring a heretic," and they had to roll with it. The results were mixed. Some lions looked like dogs with mange. Some saints had 6 fingers. One infamous woodcut meant to depict St. Jerome was so botched it appeared he was being chased by flying spaghetti. But the prints sold, and so they continued. The ink maker, meanwhile, was the least glamorous and possibly the most important figure in the shop. Ink wasn't a bottle you bought off a shelf. It was brewed like a potion, equal parts science and disaster. You needed lamp-black soot collected from burning oil, linseed oil thickened over a slow fire, and resin. The smell was apocalyptic. The consistency? Somewhere between molasses and regret. And of course, it had to dry slowly enough to soak into the paper without smudging, but fast enough to avoid transferring when pages were stacked. A bad batch could ruin weeks of work. Some printers kept their ink recipes locked away like forbidden grimoires. Others relied on superstition, stirring clockwise only, or swearing by the addition of powdered egg yolk or ox bile. One Venetian master insisted his best blacks came only when he cursed loudly during the boiling process. Maybe it wasn't alchemy, but it was certainly something. The compositors were the human engines of the shop. These men, and occasionally women, though they were paid less, naturally assembled the actual text. Using a composing stick and a case of type, they built lines of reversed letters that, when inked and pressed, would reveal the printed page. This job required speed, dexterity, and superhuman attention. A misplaced letter wasn't just a typo, it was a crime. Forget to lock the form, and the entire line could collapse mid-print. That's not just a setback, it's a disaster. There were printers who had breakdowns after watching a full galley tray crash to the floor. Think of it like spilling a puzzle, where every piece looks the same, and some might be poisoned. These artisans didn't live easy lives. Their backs ached, their hands were stained. Their lungs were clogged with dust, ash, and the faint suggestion of lead poisoning. They weren't celebrated in salons or serenaded by poets. They were often unnamed in the books they made. Their legacy was invisible, embedded in margins and margins alone. And yet, without them, there would be no printed Renaissance. No poetry of Petrarch passed through Europe. No dangerous new ideas crawling their way from scholar to scholar. No cheap almanacs that convinced villagers the moon was responsible for their goats' constipation. In a city that sold miracles in bottles and forgiveness on paper, these men, and occasionally their overlooked female counterparts, were the ones who made the paper matter. They didn't write the words, but they made sure the words survived. The irony of Renaissance printing is this: the names that endure, Aldus, Gutenberg, Estienne, weren't the ones breaking their backs setting type, or slicing their thumbs over engraving blocks. They were the names on the colophons, the signatures at the end of books. But the truth? The truth was built into the fibres of the page by people who often didn't sign their own names because they couldn't afford to. Let's walk past the press and ignore the master printer giving a tour to a noble patron, and step instead to the corner of the shop where the binders hunch over wooden boards, thick needles, and stacks of uncut folios. Binding was the last step in the process and the most unforgiving. There was no glamour in glue. You weren't praised for sewing the spine correctly. You were noticed only when you didn't. Binding required precision with tools so blunt they looked like farming implements. You had to align signatures, groups of pages folded together in perfect order. One mistake and the Psalms came before Genesis, or worse, upside down. Customers hated that, especially monks. Monks tended to carry knives. The glue boiled down from animal hooves and hide had to be applied warm, not too hot or it bubbled, not too cool or it clumped. Burned fingers were part of the job. So were infections from tiny paper cuts that festered in the fishy broth used to size the leather covers. Gloves? Surely you jest. That was for the nobility, not for craftsmen with 3 missing fingernails and an unfinished lunch that a rat just made off with. Women often worked in binding, quietly, invisibly. The guilds didn't always recognize them, but the books did. Some scholars now find subtle stitched initials hidden in spines, tucked under leather where no customer ever looked. Little acts of rebellion sown in silence. You don't get that kind of protest on Twitter. And then there were the papermakers, the most underappreciated link in the entire Renaissance book chain. Papermaking in 16th century Venice was both a craft and a punishment. Imagine soaking old linen rags in lye until they disintegrate into pulp, stirring them into vats while dodging fleas, then using wire moulds to scoop the goop, press out the water, dry the sheets on lines in a humid mill, and flatten them under heavy weights. All by hand. The smell, a cross between wet dog and plague pit. The labour, back-breaking. The pay, barely enough to buy the bread your ink-stained teeth were too cracked to chew. And yet, without them, there was no page. Parchment made from calfskin was too expensive for mass production. Papermakers brought books to the people, even if their reward was scoliosis and a shorter lifespan. If the Renaissance was an orchestra, then papermakers were the percussion essential, ignored, and always working in the background while someone else took the bow. Still, even among the artisans, a hierarchy existed. The engravers and illustrators occupied a strange limbo, half craftsmen, half artists, often underpaid and occasionally celebrated. A good woodcut could sell a book faster than any endorsement. Some shops hired entire teams just to add flair, decorated initials, border filigree, hand-coloured illustrations added one brushstroke at a time. And here's where it gets both comical and sad, because colouring was sometimes done by children, actual children. Given trays of pigment and a simple instruction, stay inside the lines. Spoiler, they didn't. There's a preserved copy of Pliny's Natural History where all the deer have blue antlers, not symbolic, just enthusiastic colouring. Some scholars suggest it was done as a joke. Others think the kid was just colourblind. Either way, that copy now sits in a university archive behind glass and is valued at more than most modern publishing contracts. Make of that what you will. Of course, the true tension in the artisan world wasn't just about hierarchy or pay, it was about authorship. Who made the book? The writer whose name adorned the title page? The printer who funded the materials? Or the dozens of hands who physically brought it to life? The Renaissance didn't bother answering. It simply shrugged and said, "History will remember the rich," and then moved on. Still, there were small victories. Some engravers signed their work with tiny symbols. A flower here, a crescent moon there. hidden in the corner of a page like medieval Easter eggs. Some typesetters deliberately left a unique ligature in one line of type, a kind of fingerprint only another compositor would spot. Even mistakes, once feared, became hallmarks of individuality. One famous edition of Ovid includes a dropped letter in the final stanza that scholars now believe was intentional. A farewell wink from a compositor who knew his work would live longer than he ever could. And that's the heartbreak, really. Because the artisans who built the Renaissance, who bled for it, died early for it, and were buried in unmarked graves outside the city, left behind the greatest contradiction of all. Their lives were anonymous. Their work was immortal. Today, we obsess over digital fonts and glossy covers, never wondering who built the logic of the page, who decided that margins should be this wide, that serifs should curve this way, that chapters should end with colophons or begin with drop caps. These decisions weren't made in boardrooms. They were made in soot-covered shops by men and women who never imagined their fingerprints would reach across centuries. And Venice, bless its corrupt little heart, gave them the tools, but not the glory. It is easy to love the Renaissance for its grandeur, the cathedrals, the frescoes, the philosophers, but it's harder, and perhaps more honest, to love it for the hands that shaped it in silence. The artisans who didn't need statues carved in their honour because their legacy lived in margins, spines, fonts and footnotes. They never held titles, but they held type. And that was enough. Chapter 4. Aldus Manutius and the Rise of the Pocketbook. Let's begin with a simple question. What do you think changed the world more? Michelangelo's David, or a book that could finally fit in your coat pocket? If you said David, congratulations, you're thinking like an art lover. If you said the book, you're thinking like Aldus Manutius. In the pantheon of Renaissance disruptors, Aldus doesn't get the attention he deserves. No moody self-portraits, no ceiling frescoes, no bloody treatises on the divine right of kings, just books. Compact, beautiful, quietly revolutionary books. He didn't build churches, he built access. And that, in the long run, might have shaken Europe even harder than marble ever did. Let's set the scene. Venice, 1494. The city is bloated with money, arrogance, and the thinly veiled stench of a dying republic trying to dress itself in brocade. Printing is already booming, but books are massive, heavy folios, tall quartos, the kind of thing you display on a lectern, not carry on a journey. Knowledge, at this point, is still physically elitist. If you're rich enough to own books, you're rich enough to have someone carry them for you. Then Aldus arrives. He's not even Venetian. He's from Bassiano, which might as well have been the moon. He's middle-aged, Greek-obsessed, and dangerously idealistic. He wants to publish Greek classics. He wants everyone to read Aristotle. He believes a better world lies in old words. How quaint. Except Aldus isn't just a scholar, he's a machine. He sets up the Aldine press in Venice and immediately starts breaking rules. First, he publishes a Greek grammar, the Institutiones Graecae Grammatices, because what better way to sell books than with a language no one speaks? Then he goes further. He launches a series of ancient Greek texts, complete with custom Greek typefaces designed by Francesco Griffo, a punch cutter with a gift for elegance and a personality that made porcupines seem cuddly. The results are stunning, but still massive, still clunky, still chained to desks in monasteries. Then comes the innovation. In 1501, Aldus does the unthinkable. He prints Virgil's works in octavo, a small, portable format the size of a modern paperback. It's affordable, it's readable, and it fits in your damn pocket. The Renaissance just got handheld. Suddenly, books aren't just symbols of wealth. They're tools. Students can carry them. Merchants can read on the road. Scholars can annotate in the margins without needing a scribe. It's the iPhone moment of 16th century publishing. Sleek, personal, and slightly overpriced. But Aldus isn't done. He wants his books to look different too. Enter italic type. Now, let's be clear, Aldus didn't invent italic, but he's the one who weaponized it. Griffo cuts the type, slanted, elegant, slightly compressed to fit more words per line. It mimics human handwriting, giving the page a sense of intimacy. For the first time, printed text looks like something your tutor might have scrawled in the margins of a manuscript, rather than the rigid blockiness of Gothic script. The world is enthralled. Scholars love it. The nobility loves it. And other printers? Oh, they hate it. Especially because Aldus has the audacity to patent his typefaces, securing a Venetian privilege to stop others from copying them. Which, of course, they do anyway. Within months, bootlegs flood the market. Half of Europe starts printing in Aldine style, fonts that Aldus never saw and would probably loathe. Welcome to the age of knockoffs. But Aldus isn't just revolutionizing design, he's also changing what gets printed. He prints Erasmus, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Plutarch, all in clean, edited editions, often with parallel Greek and Latin text. He hires humanist scholars to correct errors. He creates the first real scholarly editorial house. If the medieval world was content to preserve texts like relics, Aldus wants to refine them, question them, improve them. Dangerous stuff, really. He prints Hypnerotomachia, Polyphily, a bizarre erotic allegory written in a mix of Latin, Greek and made-up Italian, filled with illustrations of impossible architecture and pagan symbolism. It makes no sense. It's gorgeous. It's still studied today. And no, we don't really know why he printed it. That's the Aldus paradox. He was both obsessive scholar and cold-blooded businessman. He wanted to elevate minds and dominate markets. He championed free learning and pioneered limited print licenses to corner intellectual property. He believed knowledge should be shared and also paid for, preferably at a markup. And Venice, true to form, enabled him while also trying to exploit him. His shop was raided multiple times. Competitors tried to poach his punch cutters. The government issued and revoked privileges based on bribes, gossip, and political wins. Aldus spent more time defending his work from piracy than some authors spent writing theirs. He also had enemies, lots of them. One rival, Gian Giacomo Trissino, publicly accused him of corrupting the purity of Latin. Another claimed that Aldus's books were too easy to read, which, in the twisted logic of Renaissance academia, was a genuine insult. Aldus responded the only way he knew how, by printing more. His shop became a hub of scholarship and chaos. Workmen slept under the presses. Proofs were edited by candlelight. Paper shortages were constant. And through it all, Aldus signed each edition with his famous printer's mark, a dolphin entwined around an anchor, symbolizing speed and stability. It became the most recognizable logo in European publishing. But fame didn't protect him. He died in 1515, worn out, in debt, and probably poisoned by the same ink fumes his apprentices choked on daily. His legacy was carried on by his son, then his grandson, who promptly ran the business into the ground. Because, as it turns out, vision isn't hereditary. Still, Aldus Manutius changed the printed world forever. He made books mobile. He made fonts stylish. He made scholarship look good. And he did it all while fighting off pirates, pleasing patrons, dodging censorship, and reinventing the mechanics of reading. He wasn't perfect. His grammar guides were dense. His pricing was predatory. He may have invented the academic footnote, so arguably he's responsible for thousands of unread dissertations. But he understood one thing better than most of his time. If you want to change a civilization, you have to change how it reads. And maybe, just maybe, make it easier to carry the book along the way. By the time Aldus Manutius was done shrinking books into pockets, he hadn't just made reading more portable, he had made it more dangerous. Because once you remove books from the chained lecterns of monasteries and place them in the hands of merchants, wanderers, students, and the dangerously curious, something fundamental shifts. Control slips. Ideas begin to move too quickly. And for the ruling class of Renaissance Europe, that was a very real problem. Make no mistake. The invention of the pocketbook was never just about convenience. It was about mobility, about knowledge that could move faster than bishops, about words that could cross borders without papal permission. When Aldus shrank the book, he also shrank the space between the author and the reader, removing clerics, patrons, and even state censors from the chain of communication. Suddenly, a Greek philosopher didn't need a monastery to survive the next century. He just needed a saddlebag and a student with good eyesight. But let's not imagine this was welcomed. The Church, for all its patronage of learning, was never fully comfortable with printing in the first place. Books meant interpretation. Interpretation meant heresy. And heresy, as always, meant trouble. Before Aldus, books were big, expensive, and mostly confined to universities and clerical circles. You could monitor their use. You could know, more or less, who had access to what. After Aldus, good luck. Students across Italy began carrying Plato in their satchels. Travellers carried Greek epigrams in their waistbands. Some even hid questionable texts. Pagan poetry, esoteric philosophy, and erotic verse, in specially cut book pockets stitched into their cloaks. Smuggling was no longer a matter of contraband silk or Turkish spices. It was now a matter of dangerous footnotes. In response, authorities adapted. In 1515, the same year Aldus died, the Church established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It was a reaction not only to Protestantism, which was spreading like wildfire, but also to this new tidal wave of easily reproducible, easily transportable, and increasingly unreadable Greek and Latin texts flooding the educated class. Of course, banning books only made them more desirable. Enter the black market printer. These weren't ragtag operations in alleyways. Some were established shops, respectable by day, subversive by night. They printed both approved texts and banned editions, sometimes on the same press. One side of the room ran off a sanitized psalter, while the other knocked out a censored edition of Lucian's dialogues. The difference? A single flick of a switch and a slightly different colophon at the end. The Aldine press itself was accused more than once of playing this double game. While Aldus personally avoided printing overtly religious polemic, his successors were less cautious. His son, Paolo, and grandson, Aldo the Younger, tried to cash in on the Aldine brand but lacked the scholarly rigour and, more importantly, the political finesse. They printed inferior editions. They overreached. And slowly, the name that once stood for excellence became entangled in court cases, debt, and derision. And let's talk about the quality. Because, while Aldus himself obsessed over every ligature and line break, his imitators, and there were hundreds, did not. The pocketbook revolution flooded Europe with badly proofed, cheaply bound, error-ridden editions. Some pages were missing, others were repeated. Margins shrank to the point of absurdity. In one infamous pirated edition of Cicero's Tusculanae Disputationes, the printer accidentally switched the speeches of Cato and Socrates. Scholars were not amused, but people kept buying them. Why? Because the price was unbeatable. A full folio cost as much as a month's rent. An Aldine octavo? Still expensive, but attainable. Especially if you bought a second-hand copy with slightly warped pages and ink that smelled suspiciously like vinegar. And let's not romanticize the readers either. Yes, there were humanists reading Plato under olive trees, but there were also scoundrels, pamphlet mongers, unlicensed teachers, petty nobles with a taste for scandalous Greek poetry, the kind of people who read Xenophon, not for philosophy, but because someone told them it had a scene involving wine and dancing girls. Literacy may have been on the rise, but critical thinking lagged far behind. Sound familiar? Venice, for its part, played the game well. The Republic was never averse to a little hypocrisy. Officially, it supported the church. Unofficially, it turned a blind eye to book smuggling as long as taxes were paid. Aldus himself held multiple printing privileges issued by the Venetian Senate, giving him near-monopoly status on Greek texts, privileges often enforced only when convenient. The line between legality and piracy was as thin as an Aldine margin. And what about the printers themselves? They were overworked, underpaid, and often exhausted. The Aldine shop ran like a monastery without prayer breaks. Proofreaders worked by candlelight until their eyes blurred. Apprentices were routinely beaten for typos. Typesetters suffered from chronic lead exposure. Pressmen developed hernias from turning the press bar hundreds of times a day. All for the glory of printing a book that might end up banned, burned, or used to prop open a window. It wasn't romantic, it was brutal. But it mattered, because Aldus Manutius didn't just give the world elegant Greek editions and sexy italics. He gave it mobility, flexibility, access. He opened the door for secular education, for portable libraries, for the idea that knowledge should fit in your hand, not just sit on a shelf guarded by monks with Latin degrees. He democratized danger. He made heresy pocket-sized. He helped build the idea that maybe, just maybe, readers could think for themselves. And that's what scared the powers most. It wasn't the typeface. It wasn't the Greek. It wasn't even the footnotes. It was the idea that once you give people the tools to read privately, you can no longer control what they believe publicly. So yes, Aldus died exhausted and broke, and his press slowly faded into mediocrity after his death. But the world he helped unlock, it kept printing, it kept arguing, it kept learning. Badly at first, imperfectly forever, but onward. That's the real legacy of the Aldine pocketbook. Not the format, not the font, but the friction it created. Between reader and institution, between old knowledge and new freedom, between what was written and what might be understood. Chapter 5, The Business of Books. By now you might imagine the Renaissance book trade was a noble calling, an artisanal ballet of ink, intellect, and illumination. It wasn't. It was a business. And like every business, it ran on profit, posturing, and a polite disregard for the well-being of anyone lower than middle management. The Venetian print scene of the 16th century was a mix of brilliance and brute survival. At its peak, Venice churned out over 2 million books a year. An astonishing number considering each page required physical labour, dangerous chemicals, and endless squinting. The city boasted more than 200 printing houses, all jostling for relevance, revenue, and the rare privilege of not going bankrupt within 6 months. Let's be blunt, most of them failed. Opening a print shop in Venice was like opening a coffee shop in a town where everyone already owns an espresso machine. The barriers to entry were low if you had connections, and just high enough to strangle you if you didn't. You needed paper. You needed type. You needed pressmen, ink, binding supplies, and, most expensive of all, you needed access to content. Books didn't just fall from the sky. You had to acquire manuscripts, pay translators, get approval from the authorities, and hopefully bribe the right official, so your competitor's shipment of Aristotle mysteriously fell into the canal. Printing was expensive, risky, and painfully competitive. But the upside? Books sold, especially in Venice, where trade routes brought in scholars, merchants, diplomats, and troublemakers from all over Europe. Everyone wanted something to read, or at least something to buy and display as proof that they could read. Here's the catch. Most buyers weren't interested in high philosophy or ancient Greek manuscripts. They wanted practical texts, books on medicine, astrology, navigation, cookbooks, etiquette guides, sensationalized travelogues full of half-true tales about cannibals and gold-rich pagans. And if those books happened to be riddled with errors or included plagiarized chapters, so be it. Accuracy was optional. Presentation was everything. Enter the book fair. Yes, the Renaissance had book fairs. The most famous took place in Frankfurt, but Venice held its own bustling markets in plazas and festivals where printers, booksellers and customers negotiated like fishmongers. A printer would haul crates of freshly bound volumes, each one worth more than a week's food, and hope to offload them before mildew, mice, or theological controversy ruined the inventory. The art of salesmanship was crucial. It wasn't enough to print a book, you had to pitch it. That's where book prospectuses came in, early versions of promotional flyers. These described the contents of an upcoming book, praised its moral value, listed its learned contributors, and almost always exaggerated its popularity. 1522 flyer declared its forthcoming medical handbook as essential for every nobleman, housewife, and Christian physician, which raises some questions about what was actually in it. Printers who couldn't market well either sank or got absorbed into larger houses. Partnerships were common, so were betrayals, lawsuits, accusations of piracy. A printer might work with a bookseller to share the cost of a large edition. If it sold poorly, both went under. If it sold well, the bookseller might disappear with the profits and rebrand himself in another city. The Renaissance wasn't just the birth of modern learning, it was the birth of modern grift. And don't get starry-eyed about author royalties either. Writers were often paid a flat fee, if at all. The idea of intellectual property was laughable. If your manuscript was valuable, a printer would publish it. If you objected, he might publish it anyway, under a slightly different title, with your name removed or replaced by Anonymous, Scholar of the Venetian School. If you protested too much, he'd print a pamphlet mocking you and ensure it was stocked in every bookseller's stall from Milan to Ragusa. Let's not forget the guild system either. Printing in Venice was regulated. Sort of. You needed permission from the Guild of Stationers, and sometimes the Council of 10, depending on what you wanted to print. But regulations were vague and inconsistently enforced. Some guilds protected their members fiercely, others operated like medieval mafias, issuing threats disguised as citations. Want to print a book on anatomy? You'd better not offend the Barber Surgeons Guild. Want to sell a legal commentary? You'll need to grease the notaries. And whatever you do, don't forget the church. A book deemed heretical could be banned, burned, or worse. Banned, burned, and blamed on the printer. There are cases of Venetian printers who disappeared under mysterious circumstances after publishing satirical plays that poked fun at monastic orders. Officially, they fell ill or went bankrupt. Unofficially, let's just say, the Inquisition didn't need to file paperwork when a press was found abandoned. So how did printers survive? The smart ones diversified. They printed indulgences, horoscopes, broadsheets full of scandalous poetry. They forged letters of recommendation. They dabbled in political propaganda during elections, then flipped allegiances as needed. They offered discreet services to noble families, genealogies, wedding books, copies of treaties that may or may not have existed. Printers were entrepreneurs, and like all entrepreneurs, they walked a fine line between genius and fraud. Take the notorious Venetian printer who claimed to have uncovered a lost gospel and printed 1,000 copies before it was revealed to be a badly translated fragment of Seneca's letters with a crucifix crudely drawn into the margin. He skipped town. The books are collector's items now, and still they kept printing. Because even with the risks, the market was booming. Literacy rates were rising. Universities needed textbooks. Courtiers needed gift editions. Politicians needed pamphlets to slander their rivals. The hunger for the printed word was insatiable, even if no one stopped to question the nutrition of what they were consuming. In the end, the business of books in Venice wasn't just about ideas. It was about demand, about velocity, about who could move information faster, cheaper, and with enough flair to survive the next censorship sweep. Printing in Venice was capitalism wearing a scholar's robe, a delicate dance of ducats and deception. And behind the presses, the binders, the merchants, and the bootleggers, One simple truth held it all together. A book was only as valuable as the buyer's belief in its importance. And belief, like ink, could be manufactured in bulk. If the front room of the Venetian printing house was a flurry of presses and sweat, the back room was a different beast entirely. It was quieter there, not peaceful, but tense, like the silence before a merchant defaults on his debts. Here you'd find the contabile hunched over ledgers, scribbling costs in a code only half the apprentices understood. Paper, ink, wages, bribes, especially the bribes, were tallied down to the last ducat. Because if the printing press was the engine of the Renaissance, its fuel wasn't ideas, it was coin. You see, every book was a bet. A good printer had to think like a gambler, which title would hit, which obscure Greek treatise might suddenly become fashionable at the university, which poem, once banned, might now sell out because everyone's pretending they didn't already read it in manuscript form last year. And when the bet failed, and it often did, the consequences were spectacularly cruel. Paper wasn't cheap, ink was finicky, labour costs fluctuated. Deadlines were imposed by impatient patrons with short tempers and long knives. And then there were taxes, port fees, and the occasional robbery by customs. If your shipment of books got intercepted en route to Ferrara, too bad. You wouldn't be compensated. You'd be lucky if they returned the crates. Empty, of course, and usually soaked with wine for added insult. Printers went bankrupt a lot. Not gradually. Instantly. One failed edition could ruin a workshop. A poor translation of Aristotle, riddled with errors, might go unnoticed in Padua, but spark fury in Florence, where scholars would declare it intellectually unsound and threaten lawsuits. Yes, lawsuits over footnotes. If you think modern academia is brutal, try being sued in Renaissance Italy for mistranslating a participle. Worse still, printing houses were known to collaborate and sabotage in equal measure. Some formed loose alliances, pooling funds for large projects or regional distribution. Others played dirtier. One printer might send spies disguised as journeymen to scope out a rival's setup, copying typefaces or intercepting proof copies. Entire print runs were sometimes stolen from warehouses and rebranded with a forged colophon, the Renaissance equivalent of a fake ISBN slapped on a bootleg PDF. And let's not forget the ghost authors. Some printers didn't wait for scholars. They hired anonymous hacks to rewrite old texts under prestigious pseudonyms, then sold the books as newly discovered works of antiquity. One notorious Venetian printer even claimed to have found a lost dialogue by Plato that was clearly written in mangled 15th century Italian. It sold out, twice. Reputation management was everything. A single scandal. A misprint in scripture, a controversial annotation, an author caught in bed with someone else's spouse, could sink sails overnight. The public may not have been particularly discerning, but they were viciously gossipy. Printers often included long, flowery dedications in their books to powerful men, not out of respect but out of fear. A flattering paragraph to a bishop might ensure your presses weren't mysteriously shuttered the following week. Still, nothing was more sacred to the Venetian printer than the patronage letter, that gloriously self-important note at the beginning of many books in which the author, or more often, the printer posing as the author, sang the praises of a wealthy noble, thanking them for their unwavering support of the arts, while tactfully reminding them that this support ought to be renewed, preferably in coin, before the next printing run. These dedications were often masterpieces of passive aggression. 15113 edition of Seneca opened with a dedication so pointed it bordered on blackmail. To the most learned and generous Lord Visconti, whose recent silence we assume is not due to neglect, but to matters of greater political import, which we humbly trust will soon cease to interfere with his generous patronage. Translation: pay up, or we start printing Cicero with your name misspelled. Book pricing, too, was arbitrary. A single volume might cost a few soldi for a chapbook of astrology, or several florins for a leather-bound theological treatise, especially one with gold leaf in multiple languages. But don't let the flash fool you. Fancy books were often more style than substance. Many were filled with reprinted or plagiarized content, dressed up in gilded covers to impress noble buyers who couldn't read Greek anyway. If it glittered, it sold. And if it didn't sell, you slapped a Latin motto on the cover and called it a limited edition. This was capitalism before capitalism had an index. And like all good markets, it was built on the illusion of demand. People didn't always buy books because they wanted to read them. They bought them because they were seen reading them. In courts, in cafes, on gondolas. A slim octavo of Petrarch peeking out from your sleeve signalled taste, wealth, and education, even if you thought Petrarch was a kind of sausage. The performative reader is not a modern invention. Printers catered to this beautifully. They commissioned elaborate title pages, colophons, and woodcut initials to give their books gravitas. It didn't matter if the text inside was a mess. If the front page looked like a manuscript straight from heaven's own scriptorium, people paid more. Some editions even included fake rubrics, printed red ink meant to mimic the handwritten red lettering of illuminated manuscripts, just to fool the nostalgic upper class. Venice, of course, made a business of enabling all of it. The city taxed book sales. It charged fees for exporting titles. It regulated the paper trade with all the fairness of a casino house. Even the government's own printing office undercut independent printers by releasing cheaper, tax-exempt editions of legal codes and civic decrees. Imagine working months on a Venetian statute book, only for the Senate to dump its own version onto the market a week before your launch. Printers complained loudly. The state responded politely, usually with a shrug and another tax. And yet, despite the corruption, the manipulation, the endless threats of censorship and financial ruin, the presses rolled on. Because in the chaos of commerce, something genuine endured. The belief, naive perhaps, that books could outlast the mess that made them. Printers may have been hustlers, opportunists, sometimes outright crooks, but they were also preservers, disseminators. In a world where knowledge had always been chained to ivory towers and oak lecterns, they tore off the locks and sold the keys. Yes, at a profit. But who doesn't? So, next time you flip through a dusty old edition with foxed pages and cracked leather, remember this. That book might have been born in a storm of debt, fraud, and desperation. But it survived, which is more than can be said for most of the men who printed it. Chapter 6. The Censors and the Church. By the time printing presses had carved their place into the damp foundations of Venice, the written word had become more than a tool. It had become a threat. And threats, as any good pre-modern authority would tell you, had to be controlled. Not debated, not examined. Just trimmed, redacted, burned, or better yet strangled in the cradle. Into the censors. The Church had always feared language. Not the language of liturgy, of course, that was safely locked away in Latin, where only a fraction of the population could understand it. But vernacular words, accessible knowledge, the kind that spread like rumour through alleyways and taverns, that terrified them. And now, thanks to movable type and an increasingly ambitious crowd of Venetian printers, those words weren't just being spoken. They were being reproduced hundreds of times a day on paper that could travel faster than any bishop's blessing. Venice, to its eternal credit and strategic hypocrisy, walked a crooked line. On one hand, it bowed just enough to Rome to appear devout. On the other, it profited shamelessly from selling exactly the kinds of books the Church feared. Humanist manifestos, translations of forbidden Greek texts, astrological manuals, heretical poetry hidden in footnotes, and all of it moved through the city's print shops like blood through an artery, hot, vital, and just a little tainted. But as printing spread, so did scrutiny. By the mid-500s, the Venetian government established formal censorship protocols. The Council of Ten, already infamous for its secret trials and liberal use of torture, began requiring that books receive imprimatur, an official stamp of approval before being legally printed. And in case that sounded too easy, the Church introduced its own layered review system under the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a growing list of books that good Christians weren't supposed to read, let alone print. Now, getting your book approved wasn't just a matter of content, it was a matter of context. Who wrote it? What languages were used? Was the author dead? If so, had they ever been accused of heresy while living? Did the book include phrases that could be interpreted? And let's be honest, everything could be interpreted. As critical of doctrine, printers had to submit their manuscripts to ecclesiastical authorities. These censors, often overworked monks with more paranoia than literacy, combed through each page for errors, a generous term that included anything from misattributed quotes to uncomfortable philosophical questions. A single passage too sympathetic to pagans, and the whole book was denied. A marginal note suggesting that maybe Aristotle didn't get everything right? Blacklisted. One poem implying the Virgin Mary had a mortal moment of doubt. Welcome to the bonfire. The process was slow, frustrating, and, conveniently, not free. Grease, a few palms, and your manuscript might pass inspection with surprising speed. Skip the bribes, and your book might sit in limbo for months, until it was no longer relevant, or you were bankrupt, whichever came first. It wasn't censorship. It was a shakedown with theological vocabulary. And even approval wasn't protection. Because after printing, your book could still be pulled, censored retroactively, or worse, silently condemned. See, not all banned books were publicly burned. Some were simply allowed to rot, denied shelf space in respectable libraries, excluded from academic curricula, blacklisted without ceremony. The Church had learned that martyrdom turned authors into legends. Better to erase them slowly, bureaucratically, with paperwork and policy. But that didn't stop the printing. Because behind the official presses were the hidden rooms, the night shifts, the clandestine operations tucked behind shuttered storefronts or masked by respectable titles. Some books were printed in two versions, one public, sanitized and hollow, the other secret, complete, and dangerous. Clever printers would change just enough to pass inspection. Swap a god's name here, soften a conclusion there. Replace man is divine with man is flawed but redeemable, and you had theology instead of treason. And the readers? They learned to read between the lines. Literally. You could spot a censored edition by its gaps, by the unnatural silence where a question should be. A thoughtful scholar might scribble the missing line back into the margin. Sometimes they guessed wrong. Sometimes they added something worse. One Venetian edition of Lucretius was altered so heavily by censors that its entire section on atomic theory was replaced with a bland sermon about the importance of prayer. The book still sold, mostly because no one noticed the switch until years later. Printers, meanwhile, developed their own secret systems. Some embedded protest in the typography, misaligned lines forming subtle shapes. Others placed sarcastic corrections in the errata section, page 213, line 6, for God is fallible, read God is infallible. A few inserted false dedications to His Holiness the Pope, who surely has not read this book. Risky, yes. But for many printers, it wasn't just about profit, it was about resistance. Printing wasn't just production, it was protest. An act of defiance wrapped in ligature, tucked inside a binding, and sold for half a ducat at the market. Of course, not everyone played the game so cleverly. Some printers were simply caught. A few were publicly flogged. Others were imprisoned. And at least one unlucky soul was excommunicated, his presses smashed, his property seized, and his name erased from guild records. His crime? Printing a pamphlet that questioned the literal interpretation of Jonah being swallowed by a whale. The Church was not amused. Fish stories, it turns out, were sacred territory. But the grand irony of censorship was that it never really worked. The banned books always found readers. The burned pages always resurfaced. Sometimes they were recopied by hand, sometimes reprinted abroad and smuggled back in wine barrels or hollowed out religious icons. The more you banned an idea, the more people whispered about it. Printing gave ideas a kind of immortality that fire couldn't fully consume. And Venice, in its double-dealing brilliance, allowed this cat-and-mouse game to persist. The city condemned heresy publicly, while quietly profiting from its distribution. It employed censors and pirates, saints and smugglers, all under the same roof. No other city was so devout and so corrupt at the same time. So yes, the church watched. And yes, censors sharpened their quills. But the presses kept turning, because no matter how carefully you monitor the ink, once it dries on the page, it's already too late. The idea is out. And it's learning to walk. If censorship was the disease, then paranoia was the fever that came with it. And by the mid-16th century, Venice had a citywide infection. You could feel it in the streets, in the long pauses before names were spoken aloud, in the nervous glances printers gave their apprentices before handing them a manuscript. Even the rats, it seemed, moved more quietly between the alleyways behind the presses. The church, emboldened by the Counter-Reformation and increasingly nervous about all the thinking going on in the margins of Greek texts, had decided that printing wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough to justify surveillance. Dangerous enough to send informants into shops disguised as papermakers or buyers. Dangerous enough to build bonfires tall enough to be seen from the bell towers. That's not poetic license. In 1559, a public book burning in St. Mark's Square lasted 3 days. 3 days of flames, smoke, and the smell of scorched leather and vinegar-soaked glue. Whole crates of works by Erasmus, Boccaccio, and various unnamed anonymous deviants were thrown into the pyre. Some hadn't even been read yet. Didn't matter. If it came from the wrong press, had the wrong font, or quoted the wrong Greek philosopher, into the fire it went. A few printers wept, watching their life's work blacken into ash. Others just stood silently, knowing that tomorrow they'd go back to printing something safer. Hymns, calendars, psalters. The kind of thing no one reads but everyone approves of. And yet, even then, the flames weren't enough. Because for every book that burned, another was already on a ship to Antwerp or buried under false bottoms in barrels marked for Cyprus. Banning a book only confirmed it had something worth hiding. In fact, printers had a name for these works, libri fugitivi. Fugitive books. A fitting phrase for pages that moved faster than edicts and smarter than most bishops. But the church didn't stop at fire. That would have been too quick. They preferred something slower, more systematic. The Inquisition, never known for subtlety, expanded its authority in Venice under an uneasy alliance with the Republic. Technically, the Venetian Senate still claimed independence. Realistically, it knew better than to pick a fight with Rome over a few pamphlets. So a compromise was struck. Local inquisitors could monitor printing, provided they worked with Venetian officials. The result? A bureaucratic nightmare. Printers were now subject to inspections, random audits, secret reviews. Sometimes their houses were searched. Sometimes their families were questioned. No warrant needed, just suspicion and a quiet nod from the wrong cleric. One printer, accused of possessing illicit woodcuts, spent 6 months in a stone cell under the Doge's palace, only to be released when it turned out the woodcuts were diagrams of windmills. That was the level of precision we were working with. The true absurdity lay in how arbitrary it all was. A book could be banned in Rome, tolerated in Venice, and sold openly in Naples with a priest's blessing, sometimes all in the same week. The index of forbidden books grew so fast that printers stopped reading it and started guessing. Some got clever. They published catalogues that listed banned books under euphemistic titles, natural treatises instead of anatomy texts, classical reflections instead of pagan poetry. It fooled no one, but it bought them just enough plausible deniability to keep selling. And buyers? They adapted too. Scholars learned to speak in coded references. A blacklisted edition, became a difficult acquisition. Seen in Ferrara meant it had slipped past the censors. No longer available in Venice meant the Inquisition had shown interest. Bookstores had secret shelves. Libraries kept banned titles in locked chests labelled with Latin phrases, vague enough to deter casual curiosity. Fragile archives, unverified materials, incomplete liturgical texts. One story tells of a bookseller who pasted a false cover over a banned edition of Lucretius, making it look like a copy of the Book of Hours. He sold 20 before being caught. His punishment? Public shaming, a fine, and a forced apology printed in large type and nailed to the doors of his shop. He complied, but not before smuggling the rest of his inventory to Dalmatia. And still, Venice persisted in its double life. On one side, it paraded virtue. On the other, it profited from vice, especially intellectual vice. Because while censors raged against heresy, the city's wealthiest patrons quietly bought the very works they condemned. Private libraries in noble palazzos overflowed with banned material. Some families even kept secret reading rooms, locked, fireproof, and warded against gossip. A rare edition of De Rerum Natura by Lucretius could fetch a price 10 times higher simply because it had once been forbidden. Scarcity breeds value after all, even if it comes with the smell of smoke and fear. The most tragic casualties of censorship weren't always the books. They were the printers who believed, foolishly, that scholarship could coexist with scrutiny. Take the case of Girolamo Scotto, one of Venice's most respected publishers. Known for printing medical texts, musical compositions, and scholarly Latin works, he tried to walk the fine line between piety and progress. In 1564, he released an annotated edition of Aristotle that included a commentary suggesting the soul might not be entirely immortal. Theological hair-splitting, really. But it was enough. He was fined, stripped of several licenses, and forbidden from publishing philosophical material for a year. His shop never fully recovered. Others weren't so lucky. A Greek émigré named Theodoros published a harmless comparative grammar between Latin and Greek. Somehow, this was interpreted as promoting paganism. His presses were seized. He vanished into the prison system. No trial, no formal ban, just a quiet disappearance, an ink blot erased from the margins of history. And yet, despite all this, despite the risk, the rules, the fire, the silence, books kept coming, kept whispering, kept laughing in the face of repression. Because what censorship never understood, and probably never will, is that knowledge doesn't unlearn itself. A burned book doesn't vanish. It echoes. A silenced printer doesn't disappear. He is remembered in footnotes, in prefaces, in the odd italic typeset of a paragraph that reads just a little too defiantly for its time. So when you hold an old book in your hand, one printed in Venice during the age of inquisitors and ink, remember this, it might be warm from the sun. But once, it nearly burned in fire. There was a time, not long after the first movable type clattered into life, when printing was hailed as the great liberator of the human mind, a mechanical miracle that would unchain thought from monasteries and let knowledge roll freely across Europe like spring floodwaters. It sounded noble, and to some degree it was, but it didn't take long for the idealists to be shouldered aside by the opportunists, the power-hungry, the liars in elegant robes, and the kind of men who looked at a book not as a vessel for wisdom, but as a tool to control minds more efficiently than any sword ever could. And nowhere did this transition happen faster or more elegantly than in Venice, because Venice wasn't just a printing capital, it was a republic of masks, a city-state where the truth was always wearing something over its face, and in the world of Renaissance printing, truth quickly became negotiable. You could publish philosophy, yes, but it had to flatter the right doge. You could publish science, so long as it didn't contradict theology too blatantly. And you could definitely publish news, provided you didn't call it that, and also made sure it aligned with whatever narrative the state preferred that week. Enter the Avici. Those charming little handwritten or printed newsletters that circulated throughout Venice and beyond, often read aloud in taverns, posted at church doors, or quietly passed along in broadsheets disguised as merchant ledgers. The avisi were the proto-newspapers of their day, and though technically unofficial and subject to surveillance, they quickly became one of the most consumed and manipulated forms of public communication. Printers discovered that fear sold. So did gossip. So did war, even when there wasn't any. So they printed it. Reports of Turkish invasions, real or imagined. Rumours about papal assassinations. Sketchy economic forecasts. Plague numbers, inflated or deflated, depending on whether you were trying to sell masks or get pilgrims to still show up. And the public? They read it all, hungry for certainty in a world that offered none. That's the thing about propaganda. It rarely works because people are stupid. It works because people are desperate. And Venice, for all its marble and gold, was built on desperation. Desperation to survive, to compete, to control what little narrative it could before the world changed again. And the world was always changing. Wars raged, alliances shifted, popes died, trade routes closed, and the press silent, neutral, beautifully indifferent, kept pressing out words to match the mood of the moment. In the early days, printers pretended to be apolitical. We merely reproduce what is written, they'd say, as if the choice of what to reproduce wasn't already a political act. But neutrality is a myth invented by cowards, and soon enough, every major press had a patron, a faction, or at the very least, a preferred version of history. And then came the pamphlet wars. The Renaissance equivalent of a Twitter flame thread, only slower, angrier, and printed in Gothic script. Reformers and reactionaries traded insults in 5 languages. Luther's theses were followed by Catholic rebuttals. Then came counter-rebuttals, each more venomous and typo-laden than the last. Printers leaned into it. Controversy sold. One printer proudly advertised his newest publication as refuting the damnable lies of heretic dogs in 3 parts, with diagrams. Another boasted of printing the most forbidden edition yet, which, of course, sold out before noon. And when ideology got boring, they resorted to spectacle. There were printed accounts of exorcisms, witch trials, sea monsters, talking statues, and even a man in Bologna who reportedly coughed up a book of psalms. It was later revealed the man had simply hidden the pages in his shirt, but by then the 3rd edition had already been printed. The deeper truth was that printers had discovered something profound. That power didn't only flow from the sword or the coin or the altar. It flowed from the page. You could destabilize a rival by publishing a fake genealogy. You could ruin a merchant family by leaking a doctored letter. You could help get a bishop appointed or removed by carefully timed editions of slander disguised as philosophy. Some printers became information brokers. Others became spies. One notable Venetian press secretly printed anti-Habsburg pamphlets for French agents, while also selling loyalty oaths to pro-Habsburg nobles. The dual income stream was considered good business. Treason? Only if you lost. And what of the readers? They weren't stupid, but they were outnumbered, overwhelmed, bombarded. How do you sift truth from invention when the invention looks better in print? When one edition says Christ wept, and the next says Christ ruled Venice in secret. People didn't know what to believe, so they believed what felt good. What confirmed what they already wanted to hear. Sound familiar? Yes, the Renaissance was a rebirth, but not just of reason. It was a rebirth of manipulation, dressed in italic type and footnoted lies. The most dangerous ideas weren't always the most radical. Sometimes they were the most palatable. The ones that came wrapped in elegant prose and flattering logic. The ones that told you the world was simple and that your enemies were wrong, because of course they were. And the printers, they cashed in. They sold knowledge like spice. Measured in sheets, weighed in bundles, shipped across borders with forged custom stamps and hidden endorsements. Venice became the hub not only of commerce and culture, but of confusion. A city where 5 printers might release 5 versions of the same event and swear all of them were true, because truth, in the end, was just another product. And in a world where literacy was rising and trust was crumbling, it was the product everyone was desperate to buy. So when you read of Renaissance Venice as a beacon of civilization, remember this. It was also a factory of fiction, a glittering stage where history was rewritten daily, not by kings or priests, but by men with ink under their nails and ledgers full of contradictions. They didn't just print books, they printed belief. And in doing so, they built a world where the loudest voice wasn't always the wisest, but it was always the one with the cleanest margins. Power isn't just enforced, it's constructed, brick by brick, word by word, until the very foundations of belief feel immovable. And in Renaissance Venice, that construction site was the printing press. It didn't just build books, it built ideologies. Slowly, quietly, inky fingerprint by inky fingerprint, a generation's worldview could be manufactured, trimmed to specification, and wrapped in the velvet illusion of scholarship. And once it was bound and sold, it was no longer questioned. Because if it was printed, it was real. That was the myth. That was the genius. The people of Venice, like most in early modern Europe, were still adjusting to what it meant to read something not whispered by a priest or scrawled by a clerk behind monastery walls. The printed word felt permanent, ordained, blessed, even if the author was drunk and the editor barely literate. A page printed at Aldus's press was sacred. A document with a crisp colophon and a woodcut title page? That was gospel. Even if it contradicted the last book you bought. Even if the author had a personal vendetta and a flair for dramatic Latin. The audience was less concerned with truth than with the presentation of truth, and printers knew that. They exploited it. As Venice grew fatter on commerce and wider in cultural reach, printing houses shifted from workshops of knowledge to engines of influence. The government knew it. The church knew it. The merchant guilds certainly knew it. What began as a tool for dissemination of ancient wisdom morphed into an arms race of narrative control. A printer wasn't just making books, he was choosing sides. Siding with the noble family meant subsidies, protection, and contracts for printing legal codes or marriage licenses. Siding against them meant shuttered presses, ruined stock, or worse. A visit from state officials politely asking if you'd considered moving your business to Naples. Permanently. And it didn't stop with nobles. Political factions sponsored their own texts. The Council of Ten printed their own official histories. Propagandistic glosses were added to public speeches, rewritten for the page to sound more heroic, more unified, less contradictory. Wars were reported after the fact with revisions. Disasters became divine tests. Victories were stretched, and defeats quietly removed from the record. A lost trade route might be rebranded as strategic rerouting. Civil unrest became public misinterpretation. Sound familiar? Even printers who stayed out of politics couldn't avoid the tide of soft coercion. To stay in business, many agreed to publish patriotic texts. These included poems celebrating the Republic's strength, devotional books conveniently sponsored by bishops, or historical treatises that left out the parts about bribery, assassinations, and failed crusades. A well-placed woodcut of a lion. The symbol of St. Mark on the cover of a printed sermon could buy you 6 months of peace with the censors. Sometimes that was all a printer wanted. And the irony? Most people didn't care that they were being manipulated. Not really. Because in a time when plague returned every few years, when wars came and went like tides, and when the future was a fog only cleared by divine will or dumb luck, having something to believe, however curated, was better than having nothing. Certainty was the true product, and printers packaged it beautifully. Glossy black ink on linen paper. Margins wide enough to make the text look profound. Page numbers for structure. indexes for credibility. It all worked. It still does. Of course, some fought back. Humanists, radicals, reformers, and the occasional stubborn philosopher who thought that footnotes could save the world. They printed tracts, dialogues, unlicensed translations of Greek or Hebrew texts. The kind of content that made inquisitors twitch and patrons cancel dinner plans. Some of these printers were hailed as heroes in their time. Most were bankrupted. A few were imprisoned. And at least one famously disappeared, last seen boarding a barge full of unsold editions of Tacitus wrapped in Latin apologies. The boat was found. He wasn't. But even rebellion had its market. Once banned, a book gained allure. A censored text became collectible. Printing houses leaned into the scandal. Forbidden by Rome was more powerful than any preface. So they printed editions with deliberate typos in the colophon, enough to avoid direct attribution, but not enough to confuse the buyer. Others added false publisher names or foreign city origins. A particularly controversial book might claim to be printed in Basel, Cologne, or Geneva, even though it was stitched together 3 floors above a fishmonger's stall near the Rialto. This wasn't just clever marketing. It was survival. And not just for printers. For ideas. Because by the late 1500s, the printed word was no longer just an academic tool. It had become an existential one. The Reformation had weaponized scripture. Monarchs had weaponized lineage. Philosophers were now celebrity intellectuals with followings and factions. One badly phrased paragraph could start a riot. A misattributed quote could topple a career. Rumours spread faster in type than in whispers. Satirical poems, once confined to the drunken company of salons, could now be duplicated by the hundreds and tossed into fountains, posted on church doors, slipped into coat pockets. Printing democratized speech, yes, but it also commodified slander. And Venice, ruthless, adaptive Venice, learned to live with the contradiction. It cracked down on heresy one day and quietly funded a radical printer the next. It banned foreign books while re-exporting them under new titles. It accused foreign presses of undermining truth while plagiarizing their content line by line. The Republic's genius wasn't in solving its hypocrisies. It was in profiting from them. Because at the heart of it all was one enduring truth. The most valuable book is the one that tells you what you want to believe. At just the moment you're ready to believe it. And in Venice, that book could be printed by anyone. A scholar, a scoundrel, a monk with a grudge, a merchant looking for a distraction, and, quite often, a printer just trying to keep the lights on. So the next time you see a well-aged page from a Venetian press, dense with type, lined with commentary, perhaps censored or corrupted, don't ask whether it tells the truth. Ask instead, whose truth did it sell? And how many copies did it take to make the lie feel real? Chapter 8. The Risks of the Trade. To romanticize the Renaissance printer is to commit a historical injustice. Because for all the flowing scripts, the carefully balanced typefaces, and the gilded bindings resting in museum glass today, what lay behind them wasn't a legacy of quiet scholarship. It was a trail of burned fingers, broken contracts, poisoned lungs, and crushed vertebrae. Printing wasn't some elevated, cloistered affair. It was a dangerous, unregulated, back-breaking trade. A job with a death toll. A profession so riddled with risk, it makes modern office burnout look like a weekend spa retreat. Let's start with the obvious, the physical dangers of the press itself. The printing press wasn't some delicate contraption of levers and polite clicks. It was a crude mechanical beast that demanded strength and punished weakness. The platen, the flat wooden plate used to press the paper into the inked type, was heavy and unforgiving. If your hand got caught underneath it during a misaligned pull, it didn't bruise you. It crushed you. Fingers were lost, nails sheared off, tendons ruptured. Pressmen often wore thick leather wrappings, not for comfort, but to cushion the slow disfigurement of their hands over years of repetitive motion. Joint pain wasn't a possibility, it was a requirement. And it wasn't just the press that hurt you, it was everything around it. The ink was a toxic brew of soot, turpentine, linseed oil, and the kind of chemical binders that modern health authorities would ban on sight. Ink makers inhaled fumes daily, their lungs gradually blackening in tandem with their aprons. Typesetters worked in lead-pure, soft, malleable lead, which seeped into their skin, filled their pores, and eventually collected in their bones. Printer's palsy wasn't just a figure of speech, it was a real, degenerative condition. Hands trembled, teeth fell out, memory faded. And all the while, the work went on. But death by exposure was slow. More dramatic were the occupational fires, those sudden, ravenous infernos that devoured entire shops in minutes. Drying paper hanging in rafters, open flames for melting type, vats of oil for boiling glue. Add one distracted apprentice or an overturned lamp, and the result was always the same: ash. Some fires spread through entire neighbourhoods. One infamous blaze in 1536 started in a printer's shop just off Campo San Polo and consumed 4 buildings, 2 warehouses, and one unlucky bookseller who returned to rescue his dog. He survived. The dog didn't. His business never reopened. And then there were the accidents of labour. Binding required bone knives so sharp they could sever tendon with a slip. Stitching spines often meant pricking one's fingers 100 times a day. Infection wasn't rare. Neither was tetanus. No one called it that, of course. It was just the stiffening. A condition treated with prayers and vinegar compressors until your jaw locked and your back arched like a crucifixion tableau. Some printers kept jars of leeches nearby. Others simply hoped the fever would break before their debts came due. Speaking of debts, financial ruin was the most common form of death in the trade. You could be a brilliant printer, a gifted typesetter, a visionary publisher, and still fall to ruin over one botched job. Paper was expensive. So was type. So was labour. A single miscalculated edition, a misattributed author, an unpopular commentary, a trend that died faster than expected, and you were finished. Some printers were forced to sell their presses to competitors for pennies. Others tried to sell unsold stock as firewood. Still others ran. A few drank themselves into early graves in taverns paid for by books no one ever read. But the most insidious dangers were political. Print the wrong name, the wrong verse, the wrong opinion, and you weren't just bankrupt, you were branded a criminal. Venice, for all its glittering self-image as the enlightened republic of commerce and culture, had a long, twitchy history of reactionary panic. The church wasn't the only enemy of free expression. The state had its own red lines. Satire was fine unless it targeted the wrong magistrate. Criticism was tolerated until it echoed too loudly. Even historical commentary could be suspect if it dared imply that Venice had once acted with less than divine wisdom. Printers were fined, harassed, blacklisted. Some were dragged before the Council of Ten, that secretive, paranoid tribunal whose inquisitorial practices made the papal courts look downright cheerful. If you were lucky, you paid a fee and promised never to reprint. If you were unlucky, your press was dismantled in the street. An event more symbolic than effective, but deeply humiliating. A few were imprisoned. A few more vanished. Their names were quietly removed from guild records. Their works remained. Their biographies didn't. Even success could be a curse. To publish a best-selling book in Renaissance Venice was to invite scrutiny. Who was your patron? Who edited the text? Where did the manuscript come from? Was it really yours? Was it licensed? Were you profiting off God's word? Were you undermining the Republic? Were you, heaven help you, spreading Lutheran thought? It was exhausting. And through all of this, printers kept working. Not because they were fearless, but because they were trapped. Few other professions offered the same twisted cocktail of artistic pride and economic servitude. You could build a career, a family, a reputation, only to have it undone by a shipment delayed, a contract disputed, or a single smudge on a bishop's copy of Cicero. Your labour lived longer than you did. But your name, that was negotiable. The great Renaissance presses, Aldine, Giunta, Scotto, they survived not only through talent but through caution. Alliances, compromise, a touch of flattery here, a carefully phrased dedication there. They played the long game. Their founders are remembered because they were smart enough to know that idealism was for the poor and that survival was for those who understood how to read a room before they read a manuscript. So the next time you see a book dated 1540 and marvel at its design, its wisdom, its polished scholarship, pause. Remember the hands that bled for it, the lungs that coughed through its printing, the nervous apprentice who locked the door that night because he feared a knock from the wrong authority. That book may look safe now, elegant and quiet on its shelf, but it wasn't born that way. It was born in noise, in fire, in the flickering candlelight of a city that never quite decided whether it wanted truth or just the illusion of it. And for the men who made it, that illusion was often the last thing they ever owned. If burning presses, shattered fingers, and inquisitorial interrogations weren't enough to discourage you from the printing business in Renaissance Venice, then perhaps a different kind of threat might have done it. One quieter, slipperier, and infinitely more demoralizing: theft. Not the kind involving masked men with daggers in alleyways, but the refined, perfumed theft that happened in candlelit workshops, at book fairs, and across the wooden counters of bookstalls. Intellectual piracy, content counterfeiting, typeface theft. These were the daily bread of Venetian printers, and they knew it. Because no matter how carefully you designed your edition, no matter how artfully you spaced your lines, or how proudly you included your name on the colophon, the moment that book left your shop, it was no longer yours. Someone else would copy it, reprint it, misprint it, underprice it, sell it in another city with your reputation and none of your quality. Welcome to the Renaissance version of open source, except without permission, licensing, or the courtesy of acknowledgement. If you were lucky, your stolen work would still resemble the original. If you were unlucky, it would include fabricated chapters, warped arguments, and blurry woodcuts done by someone's half-blind nephew who had never seen a lion, but was pretty sure it had 3 legs and a beak. The worst offenders were rarely punished. Venice, ever the pragmatic republic, understood that piracy was part of the cost of business. You could sue a rival for copying your edition, sure, but good luck finding a judge who cared, let alone one not already paid off. Laws existed, technically. The Venetian government issued privileged temporary monopolies granting a printer exclusive rights to a certain work for a number of years. Aldus Manutius famously secured several, but these privileges were barely worth the parchment they were printed on. Enforcement required influence, money, and the kind of legal stamina most printers couldn't afford. And besides, if your rival simply changed a few words in the title, adjusted the format, or tacked on a misleading attribution, newly revised from an older, better manuscript, the authorities would likely shrug and move on. Counterfeiters weren't hidden. They were part of the ecosystem. Sometimes, printers pirated themselves. Desperate to move unsold stock, they would rebrand old editions under new covers. A tired commentary on Aristotle might be repackaged as a newly corrected and expanded edition, even if the only change was the removal of an embarrassing typo. Some shops added fake dates or swapped cities, Cologne instead of Venice, Paris instead of Padua, to give the impression of exotic origin. Readers ate it up. Foreign books sold better. German printers in particular were envied and feared. Their typefaces were sharper, their bindings tougher, their pricing unfortunate. Many Venetian presses couldn't compete, so they borrowed the prestige. Or, more accurately, they faked it. And then there were the international pirates, printers in Lyon, Basel, Krakow, who eagerly gobbled up Venetian content and reissued it with no remorse. Translations were especially vulnerable. Once a Latin edition of a popular work hit the streets, It was only a matter of time before someone in Poland printed a local version based on a pirated copy, stripped of commentary, riddled with mistakes, and sold at half the price. Worse, buyers didn't always care. The average customer, usually a student, a cleric, or a moderately literate nobleman, rarely had the means to compare editions. They trusted the colophon. They trusted the binding. They trusted the illusion. But printers did not. Trust among printers was a myth, and alliances were fragile at best. Partnerships frequently collapsed under the weight of ego and suspicion. Co-owned shops ended in lawsuits. Apprentices were accused of stealing type, manuscripts, even entire galleys of set pages to sell to rival houses. In one infamous case, a disgruntled journeyman absconded with a nearly finished edition of Livy, fled to Ferrara, and reprinted it under his own name. He added a preface, apologizing for errors introduced by a previous incompetent employer. His former master nearly had a stroke. The edition outsold the original. No justice followed. Printing contracts, when they existed, were more ceremonial than binding. A noble patron might commission a devotional tract, promising payment upon delivery. The printer would invest weeks into the edition, only to find the patron had moved to Florence, or died of plague, or suddenly discovered a rival cousin with better taste in fonts. Payment vanished. So did the order. The printer was left with a stack of useless pages no one wanted, since devotional tracts weren't exactly bestsellers unless the author was a saint or recently martyred. And let's not forget the anonymous saboteurs, the whisperers who spread rumours about flawed editions, false texts, or even fabricated heresies embedded in rival publications. A single well-placed accusation could doom a print run before the first page hit the binding table. Even if untrue, even if laughable, it lingered. Buyers hesitated. Reputations sagged. Booksellers turned cautious. Sometimes, just to avoid the hassle, printers withdrew the edition altogether, quietly pulping the pages and swearing to never touch of it again, even if begged. All of this bred an atmosphere of quiet paranoia. Printers developed habits that bordered on obsessive. Some kept their type designs locked in wooden chests guarded at night. Others numbered every proof copy, tracked every buyer, and burned test prints so no one could reconstruct the final work from fragments. A few refused to share drafts outside of trusted circles, and even then only under oath, or at knife point. Intellectual property as a concept did not yet exist, but intellectual theft, that was a daily ritual. The irony was that Venice benefited from all of it. Pirates kept the market hot. Rivalries spurred innovation. Sabotage fed the rumour mill, which in turn fed demand. The Republic collected taxes on all sales, legitimate or not, and saw no reason to intervene unless the fighting disrupted trade, or unless someone important complained. But everyday printers? They were left to fend for themselves. There was no union, no safety net, only risk, debt, and the hope that maybe this next edition would sell enough to stay solvent another month. Still, they persisted. Because for all the betrayal, all the theft, all the cruel mathematics of a market designed to eat its own, the act of printing remained somehow worth it. To hold a finished book, ink fresh, pages aligned, the binding tight and right, that was still a small miracle. A silent victory. Proof that, despite the theft and backstabbing and the dozen ways the world tried to smother you, your work existed. It was real. And sometimes that was enough. So the next time you admire a pristine Renaissance volume and marvel at its clarity and balance, know this: it may be stolen. It may be counterfeit. It may be the result of 3 betrayals, 2 rebrandings, and 1 apprentice who fled in the night with the only clean proof. But it's here. It survived. And in a city that treated truth like merchandise, that survival against all odds is the closest thing to authenticity anyone ever had. Chapter 9: Readers, Collectors, and Scholars. For all the blood, ink, and intellectual trench warfare that defined the Venetian print industry, There was one group without whom none of it would have mattered: the readers. They were the final, often forgotten, link in the Renaissance book chain. The hands that turned the pages, the minds that absorbed or ignored the words, the people who justified the whole exhausting enterprise of carving meaning into dead trees. And contrary to the sentimental notion that every printed book was a torch passed to a grateful, knowledge-starved soul, the reality was far more complicated. Readers came in types. There were the scholars, yes, bony, red-eyed men who lived for marginalia and slept in the same robes they taught in. But there were also the collectors, the posers, the page-sniffers, the nobles who couldn't read past a title, but insisted on a full library bound in matching red Moroccan leather to impress their guests. And then there were students, God help them, who bought books only to resell them at a discount once exams ended, their margins filled not with commentary but with doodles and profanity in 3 languages. Venice had them all. By the early 16th century, the city was teeming with buyers. Bookstalls stood next to bakeries. A well-dressed patrician might stop to examine a new edition of Pliny while his servant waited with figs. Sailors picked up cheap almanacs to track tides or learn which saints governed which illnesses. Housewives flipped through herbal manuals hoping to discover whether rosemary really cured a cheating husband. And children too young to afford books stood wide-eyed at the stalls, staring at the woodcut illustrations of beasts, angels, and battles, not understanding the text but transfixed by the imagery. It was chaotic, messy, and gloriously human, and printers, despite their frustrations, adored it, because readers meant survival. But not all readers were created equal. The scholars, for instance, were the bane and backbone of the trade. They demanded accuracy, footnotes, parallel texts, and detailed indices. They sent letters correcting errors. They annotated every page until it resembled battlefield topography. Some sent entire pages back with notes like, "This semicolon should be a comma, and the argument is logically unsound." They were never satisfied. If an edition included 6 Greek sources, they wanted 8. If a word was translated too plainly, they accused the translator of barbarism. And yet, when they approved a book, truly approved it, their word was golden. University professors endorsed texts that stayed in circulation for decades. Their names were worth more than a printer's colophon. But their endorsements came slowly, often after months of delay and back-channel diplomacy. They preferred manuscripts, if we're being honest. Books were too democratic, too available. Then came the collectors, noblemen, diplomats, clergy with more money than sense, and the new class of merchant elites who saw books not as vessels of knowledge, but as status objects. They bought printed works in bulk, by theme or format or colour. Some paid extra to have their initials embossed on the cover, not realising the contents hadn't changed since the last edition. They wanted Virgil and Seneca, yes, but they wanted them to match. They wanted illuminated initials, gold-trimmed spines, custom dedications that made them seem like patrons of genius. They displayed their books behind locked glass, unread and undisturbed, guarded like relics. One noble in Verona famously commissioned an entire library of blank books, blank just for show. They were bound, titled, shelved alphabetically, and never once opened. A monument to the idea of reading without the burden of actually doing it. Of course, this irritated the scholars to no end. There are recorded letters, angry, scathing letters, from professors complaining that the best editions were being hoarded by people who couldn't pass a basic Latin clause. The blind possess the lamp, one wrote, but never light it. But printers didn't care. The blind paid in full. And besides, a wealthy collector might commission a new edition of a classical work just to attach his name to it. The printer got paid, the translator got paid, the book got printed. Whether it was read was someone else's problem. There was also the middle ground, the literate merchant class. They were practical. They bought books on navigation, medicine, commerce, and etiquette. They were hungry for information, not prestige. They didn't annotate. They didn't frame their books like art. They read them. Sometimes aloud, in groups after dinner in mixed company. This horrified scholars and delighted printers. Because middle-class readers created demand. They asked questions. They wanted new editions. They encouraged the printing of material that no academic would bother with. Travel guides, devotional manuals, cookbooks, astrology charts, and even erotica disguised as philosophy. These readers fueled the explosion of print culture more than any university ever did. And their children? Their children learned to read young. Education was changing, slowly but undeniably. Literacy was expanding. Not dramatically, but enough. Town schools increased in number. Some printing houses collaborated with teachers to produce simple primers. The alphabet was no longer just the gateway to Latin prayer. It became the path to independence, argument, and eventually dissent. A boy who learned to read could challenge his father's superstitions. A girl who learned to write could document abuses. Printing cracked the monopoly of oral tradition and, with it, the unspoken codes of submission. And yes, it caused discomfort. Families argued over texts. Clergy warned against excessive private reading. Some teachers discouraged interpretation. But the genie was out. Still, not everyone welcomed the shift. Certain elites feared the crudeness of public literacy, believing it led to arrogance and confusion. One cardinal called the printing of medical texts in vernacular Italian a dangerous invitation for fools to believe they are physicians. Another lamented that farmers now quoted Aristotle badly while ignoring their planting schedules. The fear wasn't that people were learning. It was that they were misapplying learning. That knowledge, without gatekeepers, was indistinguishable from noise. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Misinformation wasn't born in the internet age. It was alive and well in 16th century Venice, where one pamphlet could claim leeches cured gout, and another argued the moon caused political instability. Both sold out. But printers didn't moralize. They printed what sold. And, for better or worse, readers decided the rest. So the next time you see a Renaissance book, aged, worn, lovingly rebound, don't assume it lived a sacred life in the hands of a thoughtful scholar. It might have been ignored, hoarded, or used to prop up a table. It might have been owned by someone who never read a word, or someone who underlined the wrong ones, or someone who read it so obsessively that the spine collapsed and the pages absorbed the oils of their fingers until they crumbled. That too was readership, messy, vain, brilliant, confused, and very, very human. The strange thing about reading, especially in a city like Renaissance Venice, was that it was both a personal act and a public performance. In the dim corners of a candlelit room, a merchant might read a political satire alone, brows furrowed, lips moving as he whispered each line. But take that same book, place it in the courtyard of a university, or slip it into a student's hands during a sermon, and suddenly the act wasn't just personal. It was a challenge, a ripple, sometimes a firestorm. This was the creeping power of the printed word. It amplified thought in unpredictable ways. And in Venice, a city already teetering between tradition and mercantile modernity, that power became both tool and weapon, blessing and liability. Because, by the mid-1500s, books had started doing something that alarmed both church and state, they were beginning to disagree. Not just with each other, which was common enough. Two authors could argue over whether Cicero had meant virtue or duty for 6 chapters, but with authority itself. Some books questioned dogma. Some critiqued the government. Some, most dangerously, called for reforms. It didn't take long for the Republic of Venice, that famously ambiguous guardian of liberty, to realize that it was housing not just printers, but potential revolutionaries in sheepskin bindings. And yet, despite the escalating censorship, readers multiplied. The more books the authorities banned, the more desirable they became. It was the Renaissance version of banned in Boston. a mark of irresistible allure. Underground reading circles formed in taverns, libraries disguised themselves as private inventories, and Venetian gondoliers, who were technically illiterate, memorized passages read aloud and whispered them like urban legends across the canals. It was proof that you didn't need to hold a book to be infected by its ideas. The print revolution had outgrown its creators, and so had its readers. There was now a new breed of reader emerging, the self-taught skeptic. These were artisans, mid-level scribes, apprentices, and occasionally clever women with access to family libraries. People who weren't supposed to challenge scholars but did anyway. They read theological tracts, not for devotion but to find inconsistencies. They read histories to detect omissions. They read philosophical texts and rewrote them in the margins with saltier opinions and more relevant insults. In some households, this kind of behaviour got you locked in a convent. In others, it got you promoted. The line between heretic and innovator was always blurry, especially in Venice. The church, of course, panicked. In 1559, Pope Paul IV released the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of books so dangerous they were better off not existing. It was ambitious, broad, and unintentionally promotional. Among the banned works were scientific treatises, political manifestos, and poetic critiques of the papacy. Venice, to its credit, or perhaps its shame, ignored much of it. The city's printers couldn't afford to stop printing what people wanted, and the people, increasingly, wanted provocation. There were whispered rumours of mothers reading Erasmus while their children slept, of widowers discovering Montaigne and weeping into the margins, of tailors quoting Petrarch to their customers as they measured inseams. It sounds absurd, romanticised even, but the documentary evidence is surprisingly abundant. Books weren't just being owned, they were being read, discussed, loaned, stolen, hidden, and reprinted. Knowledge had leaked beyond the boundaries of classroom and pulpit, and the authorities, for all their efforts, were now chasing ghosts. It wasn't just the content that made books dangerous, it was the confidence they instilled. Once a reader had followed a printed argument, dissected its reasoning, and compared it to another. Once he had done that, he was never again the same kind of subject. He had tasted independence, however small. And in a world that demanded conformity in exchange for survival, even a drop of independence was flammable. This shift affected the social fabric of Venice in subtle but measurable ways. Debates in wine shops became more ideological. Marriages occasionally ended over doctrinal disagreements, at least according to some confessional records. Guild meetings now included books as part of inheritance disputes, and lawyers began to cite published pamphlets as supporting material, sometimes to the horror of judges who preferred good old-fashioned bribery to modern reasoning. Still, not every reader was a firebrand. Most weren't. Most were simply trying to understand their world, in an age where that world was expanding too fast to keep up with. The discovery of the New World, the fall of Constantinople, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of mercantile capitalism, the slow demise of chivalric values. All of it was happening at once, and the only way to process it was to read about it. Books became not just mirrors, but maps, and readers clung to them even when they didn't understand them, because they offered a sense, however fleeting, that something made sense. But let's not get too sentimental. Books were also used to mislead. Pseudoscience, religious manipulation, political lies, all printed, all distributed, all believed. Some printers knowingly published fraudulent histories to flatter patrons. Others sold miracle cures wrapped in classical language. A few published anti-Semitic or anti-Islamic tracts to curry favour with the Vatican. And readers consumed these with just as much hunger as they did the real stuff. It's a sobering reminder that the printing press didn't invent fake news, it just made it faster. And let's not forget the gender divide. Female literacy was rising, but slowly. For every daughter secretly reading Ovid, there were 10 more being told to stick to embroidery manuals. Some books were printed for women, with pastel covers and patronizing advice. Others simply left women out of the discourse altogether, as though knowledge had no womb. Yet, within convents and aristocratic homes, a silent rebellion was forming. Nuns copied banned texts by hand. Noblewomen hosted quiet reading circles. One Venetian widow financed the publication of a devotional poem under a male pseudonym. She never claimed credit. But the dedication was written in a script suspiciously similar to hers. So here we are, in the middle of the 16th century, and Venice is buzzing with books. Some honest, some deceptive. Some revolutionary, some regressive. But all alive. And the readers, diverse, fallible, curious, arrogant, hopeful, were shaping history with every turning page. It was messy. It was flawed. But for the first time in centuries, the truth wasn't being dictated from pulpits or palaces. It was being argued over. And in a city like Venice, built on contradiction, that was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. Chapter 10. The ink never truly dries. By the end of the 16th century, the clang of hammers on movable type no longer startled the city. The scent of fresh ink mingled with the fishy salt air, and nobody looked twice at apprentices running down the alleys with proofs flapping in their hands. The printing press had become furniture. Familiar. Functional. And yet, what it produced still had the power to inflame, enlighten, or erase. Venice, for all its gold and glamour, remained one of the great paradoxes of the Renaissance, open to knowledge, yet constantly terrified by what that knowledge might do. Printers aged quickly. The job was brutal on the body. Hours bent over the press meant bad backs and ink-stained fingernails that never quite came clean. Lead dust lingered in the lungs. Eyes weakened under candlelight. Fingers grew stiff from assembling type. And even the most successful master printer might die broke, his inventory seized by creditors, his final pamphlet left unbound. Because for every bestseller, there were shelves of unsold volumes on worm-eaten wood books that missed the political moment, or backed the wrong philosopher, or simply bored the public. Being a printer in Venice was as much about timing as talent. And even the most precise typesetting couldn't fix bad timing. Aldus Manutius, that darling of the educated elite, died in 1515. His press lived on through his son and grandson, each bearing his name, each a little less brilliant, a little more careful. By the third generation, the Manutius name was more brand than innovation. They produced respectable work, annotated classics, scholarly reprints. But the fire was gone. The press that once risked everything to publish Aristotle in pocket-sized editions now printed ecclesiastical treatises and trade contracts. There's something oddly poetic about that, like watching a revolutionary turn into a bureaucrat in real time. Or maybe that's just the natural arc of influence, burn hot, cool down, fade into standardization. But even as the presses dulled, their shadows grew longer. The books printed in 1500 were still being read in 1600, though not always for the reasons the authors intended. A love poem might be used to teach Latin. A scientific diagram repurposed in a witchcraft trial. A philosophical tract dissected in a heresy investigation. Books, once printed, had no loyalty. They served whoever opened them, and that made them both dangerous and indispensable. The Church, despite centuries of hand-wringing, had begrudgingly embraced print, at least when it could control the message. The index of forbidden books was updated with terrifying frequency, sometimes banning entire publishers by name. But even inquisitors knew that to reach hearts and minds they needed to compete. So they printed their own texts, devotional manuals, biographies of saints, illustrated martyrdoms that dripped blood in woodcut detail. Fear, too, could be printed. And it sold well. Universities joined in. What began as resistance to the printing press gave way to reliance. Professors who once sneered at printed glossaries now assigned them as required reading. The bound text replaced the wandering lecturer, and with it came a new kind of student, one who read in silence, alone, skeptical. Not necessarily smarter, just more practiced in mimicry. Collectors emerged, the Renaissance equivalent of intellectual hoarders. They built libraries in private towers, hunted first editions like relics, and occasionally funded entire presses just to ensure their names appeared in dedications. Knowledge, once shared in salons and monasteries, was now chained in cabinets, not metaphorically, literally. Some books were so valuable they were locked to the shelves with iron clasps, and still they disappeared. Theft of books became a minor epidemic. It was hard to say whether this was a crime of greed or reverence, perhaps both. Perhaps that's always been the problem with knowledge. People either hoard it or burn it. Meanwhile, the average reader was evolving. By 1600, reading aloud had become less common. Silent reading, once considered odd or even suspicious, was now the norm among educated classes. This changed everything. Words no longer had to perform for a room. They could murmur secrets, stir private doubts. Reading became a dialogue, not a performance. And in that silence, many readers began to think dangerous things. Printers knew this. Some leaned into it, designing books with margins wide enough for notes, pages numbered for discussion, and prefaces that invited interpretation. Others resisted, printing tight, columned texts that left no room for dissent. The war over minds was now being fought in layout and font, as much as in content. Typography had become theology, and all this unfolded in Venice, a city built on water, corruption, and contradictions. The same city that censored heretical books, published guides to religious tolerance. The same senators who banned foreign political texts, commissioned flattering histories of their own families. The same church that condemned worldly vanity employed printers to produce indulgence, slips with gilded ink. Hypocrisy wasn't a bug. It was the business model. Yet despite the hypocrisy, or maybe because of it, something remarkable endured. The idea that truth might still be found in print. Not guaranteed, not pure, but possible. And that idea, fragile though it was, carried forward. Printers died, names faded, shops closed, but their books travelled, across borders, across centuries. Some ended up in royal libraries, others in flea markets, a few in flames. Most just passed from hand to hand, smudged by fingers, misunderstood, occasionally adored. And so here we are, 500 years later, still arguing over what gets printed, still fighting about which narratives deserve paper and ink, still pretending, in some quiet way, that if it's printed, it must be real. But maybe the real legacy of the Venetian printers isn't in the books they made. Maybe it's in the questions they left behind. About authority, about memory, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that you're still listening means they won. Because the ink may dry, but the conversation doesn't. Let's begin where most stories end, in silence. Not the dramatic kind, with thunderclouds and final gasps, but the quiet aftermath. The press has cooled. The apprentices have gone home. The last sheet hangs like a drying fish above a half-empty bottle of wine. It's midnight in Venice, and somewhere a printer's ghost mutters about margins. And perhaps that's fitting, because history, as it turns out, isn't written by the victors. It's printed by the tired. There's something almost tragic about the printer's fate. He touched revolutions, yet died a tradesman. His shop changed the world, yet his name, more often than not, ended up as a smudged colophon on page 12. And even when he was remembered, it was rarely for who he was. It was for what he produced, a faceless machine behind a miracle of dissemination. But miracles, when repeated daily, lose their shine. By the late 1500s, printing was no longer exotic. It was expected, like bread, or lies. Let's talk about those lies. Venice had no shortage. It was, after all, a city that marketed itself as incorruptible while drowning in bribes. A republic built on civic virtue and tax evasion. Printing in such a climate became an exercise in diplomacy, subterfuge, and occasionally outright fakery. Need a papal bull faked for your cousin's marriage? There was a guy. Want a map of the New World that conveniently omitted competing Spanish claims? There was a printer who'd do it for the right price. Authorship became porous. Truth became negotiable. But the ink stayed. By the end of the Renaissance, printing had helped produce nearly every tool of modernity. Scientific journals, government propaganda, erotic poetry, shopping catalogues, calendars, constitutions. The sheer range is staggering. And yet, even with all this output, one has to ask, did it make us smarter, or just better at repeating ourselves with citations? Because the dark truth is, not all printing advanced thought. Some of it shackled it. The same press that gave us Copernicus also spread witch-hunting manuals. The same fonts that spelled out Plato were used to publish racist pseudoscience. Literacy rose, yes, but so did conformity. As more people read, fewer dared to write. As more books were printed, fewer ideas felt new. The press enabled echo chambers centuries before we named them, and at times it felt less like liberation and more like mass production of consensus. And yet, for every disappointment, there was a spark. A pamphlet smuggled through customs. A heretical tract passed hand to hand in candlelit rooms. A radical idea buried in the footnote of an almanac. These were the flickers that refused to be extinguished. That is the other legacy of the Venetian printer. Not just the books on shelves, but the ones that refused to stay silent. Consider the apprentices. Most never made it to master. Their names were lost in invoices and daily logs, yet they carried knowledge across borders. A journeyman trained in Venice might end up in Lyon or Krakow or London, bringing with him not just technique but temperament, a certain irreverence for official stories. They carried the Venetian virus, an addiction to dissemination. Or consider the women. Rarely credited, often invisible, yet present in the background. Setting type, binding pages, managing accounts. Some even ran presses after their husbands died, operating under their names, printing poetry and politics with equal fervour. They weren't celebrated, but they printed celebration. And that, in the long term, is far more powerful. And what of the books themselves? They aged, they foxed, they burned. Some were used as fire starters. Others lined trunks or stuffed cracks in windows. A few were buried with their owners, but most just faded, their relevance slowly peeled away by new discoveries, new additions, new regimes. Their truths became outdated. Their bindings split. But still, they persisted, silent witnesses to their time. Even now, tucked in climate-controlled vaults, they whisper. You can't hear it, not directly, but the weight of them presses into the silence of every modern archive. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, that even ink, supposedly eternal, fades, and that every truth printed today might be mocked tomorrow, or banned, or rediscovered in some dusty attic by a historian with insomnia and a bad sense of professional boundaries. So here's to the printers. The ones who set the type and hoped for the best. Who got paid in IOUs and rumours. Who lied to censors with a straight face, then snuck out back to print the truth. Who argued over serifs like philosophers. Who ruined their eyesight for books nobody read. Who, in the end, built the modern world. Not with grand speeches or bloody wars, but with trays of lead, the crank of a press, and a prayer that someone, somewhere, might understand. It is fitting that many of their stories remain half-told, because to be a printer in Renaissance Venice wasn't to seek immortality, it was to gamble on it, to put words into the world and hope they outlived you, to believe, foolishly and profoundly, that the future would still be listening. And maybe it is. Maybe tonight someone is reading by lamplight, Maybe they stumble across a phrase, half Latin, half truth, and pause. And in that pause, the ghost of a Venetian printer smiles. Because the press is gone, the ink has faded, the city has changed. But the conversation, it continues. So if your eyes are heavy now, and your thoughts still lingering in candlelit alleys, among the whispering leaves of a half-bound folio, know this. The world we read today was shaped by men and women whose names we'll never know. Their lives pressed between pages, smudged by time and thumbprints. They weren't saints. Most weren't even scholars. They were printers, tired, ink-stained, occasionally drunk, often underpaid. But they believed, perhaps naively, that ideas mattered. That knowledge deserved to outlive empires. That truth, even when censored or twisted or buried in footnotes, had a fighting chance if it found its way into ink. And tonight, as we close this final chapter, maybe you'll dream not of battles or kings or revolutions, but of something quieter. The creak of a wooden press, the hiss of wet paper peeled from a form, a single candle flickering over a tray of lead type, arranged not just to inform, but to endure. Thanks for wandering through the shadows of history with me. Until next time, sleep well and question everything. You've been listening to The Drowsy Historian, where sleep meets subversion, one forgotten page at a time.